G'day humans, Chris Stead from Finder here. We're talking NFT games, and today the subject is Guild of Guardians. Now this is a party-based action RPG / dungeon crawler that's been published by Immutable, made by Stead Games, and is hitting mobile platforms sometime in 2023, later half of 2023. But there is some demos available now that people have been playing and getting a taste of what kind of experience that we can expect from this game. So I thought it was a great opportunity to catch up with the game's director, Derek Lau, to find out more about what Guild of Guardians is about, what it offers, and what we can expect from it in the future as its roadmap unfolds. So let's dive in and have a chat to Derek. G'day Derek, thanks very much for joining me for a chat today, mate.
Hey, yeah, excited to be here, excited to talk about, all things Guild of Guardians.
Well, mate, to start, can you just detail your role at Immutable and also with Guild of Guardians?
Absolutely. I am the VP and Game Director of Guild of Guardians. So I'm basically accountable for making sure that the game is successful. So for what success means for us is that we've made a really meaningful game, which millions of players can play and enjoy. It's a game that the team is proud of, of having built, and that the community is proud to be a part of as well, and also being commercially successful.
Now, before we dive into the game itself, for those who aren't aware, Immutable isn't just a game publisher and developer. It's also, a middleware engine supplier with Immutable X. So what does that do, and how is Guild of Guardians, I guess, a proof of concept for Immutable X?
So within Immutable, there's two parts of the business. So Immutable is a VC-funded startup based out of Sydney, and we have Immutable X, which is the platform, and Immutable Game Studios, which is where we do our games. And so Immutable X is a layer 2 scaling solution for Ethereum. And what that means is it allows games like ourselves to integrate blockchain easily into the game just using APIs, and to make this kind of a very seamless and scalable experience. So Immutable X doesn't have any gas fees. It's very scalable, and it's also still as secure as the underlying technology of Ethereum, which is what it's based off.
And obviously, Guild of Guardians uses that platform.
Yes, correct. So we use that in our game.
So onto the game itself. What's your elevator pitch for Guild of Guardians?
So Guild of Guardians is a mobile team RPG. As a player, you summon teams of guardians, you join guilds, and you kind of defend against different monsters and bosses in this fantasy world called Eldarin. And as you play through the game, you progress, you make your team stronger, and you really work together with other players in your guild to kind of be the best and play throughout the game.
So, when I first looked at it, just at a glance, the first game that popped to my mind was Torchlight, maybe even Bastion, or even like a WoW raid. Has there been any titles in particular that have inspired you with Guild of Guardians?
So Guild of Guardians certainly takes inspiration from kind of traditional fantasy RPGs. Think about kind of, World of Warcraft, Diablo, even Dungeons and Dragons. When you're playing in the game, you don't only just play as humans, you can play as an orc, as an elf, as all these different magical creatures. But we also try to lean on that, but we also try to keep it familiar to the audience as well. And so, and fresh to the audience as well. So we kind of add our own twist to this fantasy world.
So, as you mentioned, the game's pitched as an RPG, but what are the RPG mechanics we can anticipate? Obviously, it looks a bit more like a dungeon crawler, so on the leveling, looting, crafting, inventory management side of it, more so than perhaps story, dialogue, trees, character. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so it's a squad-based RPG, which means that players send in a team of 4 heroes into dungeons at a time, and they're controlling these heroes as you would in kind of like a top-down isometric RPG game. You can run around, use abilities, attack, etc., dodge, etc. And the game is centered around these dungeons, which are kind of all instance-based dungeons where players will encounter different types of enemies, different bosses. There'll be different challenges and traps and all these different things as well within the different dungeons. So that's kind of the core gameplay is centered around that.
And so you mentioned the dungeons. So the action is focused on instant dungeons in the alpha anyway. Like, will there ultimately be an overworld that that players will explore, kind of similar to Diablo?
So currently there's no plans to create kind of a massive open world. A lot of the core things happen within the dungeons, but we do have different game modes that are planned as well. So the idea of having guild raids, so being able to, send in a character, and your other guildmates send in a character, and you're fighting a boss together. There'll also be the idea of different challenge towers and things like that, where you're trying to work your way up different levels and kind of, reach the top of the tower and see how far you can get. And it gets harder and harder as you go up. So there'll be different versions of this, and most of it will be within dungeons and not in an open world.
So the gameplay is party-based. So with players forming a team of guardians, 3 of which controlled by the AI. But how does the multiplayer work then? So you mentioned teaming up with other players and guilds. Do you still control a team of 4, or does each player bring in one hero? And if that's and how is loot handled in this scenario?
So currently the way the game works is a lot of the social and multiplayer mechanics are in the metagame. And so you can think of it like a lot of the cooperation is asynchronous. So for example, we have a mechanic in the game called guild crafting, where players actually have to work together with a guild to find lots of different resources that are going to be almost impossible for an individual to get themselves, right? And they're working together to get these resources in order to craft. Then there'll also be guild raids as well, where players are sending in one hero, and like everyone in the guild is sending in a hero in order to fight this boss or monster. And then, as the game evolves, we'll look at other modes as well, where perhaps players are going to be sending in, one hero to teaming up with 3 other players at the same time.
Right. Okay. So there is hopefully an end goal, I guess, where you're playing co-op with 4 other players hitting a dungeon.
Yeah.
Awesome. Now, reading through the white paper, one, I guess, red flag potentially for me was the energy boosters, which kind of spoke to some of the, I guess, less friendly mobile monetization strategies we've seen in the past. I mean, how does it work and why is it in the game?
So the way the game works is there's a resource called energy. So just like other mobile games, which I'm sure you're familiar with, over time, you get more and more energy and you use the energy to fight through dungeons. And what an energy booster does is it gives you, it allows you to basically have more energy or less fatigue. So your heroes can go through dungeons more. The idea behind it is actually to be more player friendly. So, typically in mobile games, players can just will through the app buy energy using real world dollars, and they can just buy a lot of it and progress. For us, we actually have an energy, we see energy as a resource that we still want people to be able to buy, but it's actually capped. So like players can only have 1 energy token that they can use. They can't just buy 100 and then all of a sudden get infinite energy. So it's in that sense, it levels the playing field a lot. And also, if someone buys it, they can also choose to resell it later as well. It's not a sunk cost. And so there's a few elements here which we believe actually makes it more fair actually than some other existing mobile games, which may be more predatory in terms of how they sell energy.
So how long will a player who's just started be able to raid dungeons until they're at a point where they're out of energy for the day?
That's a good question. That's something that we're tinkering around with. It basically depends on the balance. We expect players to be playing for maybe an hour to 2 hours a day. Like we don't want players to need to grind for hours and hours. That's not sustainable. We want the game to be enjoyed for years and have shorter playing sessions. And so what we would expect is players actually run out of energy pretty quickly. You don't need to play for 8 hours a day to use all your energy. And then over time, every 15 minutes or so, you'll get some energy back. So you'll be able to accumulate that and play the next day.
Right. So, I mean, the game is in alpha at the moment. What have you learned thus far from player feedback?
So far, the game has been in development for around 2 years. We've released a few demos. It's not quite in the alpha stage yet, but we have released a few demos of the game so far. So far, we've learned quite a few things. So, I think overall the reception has been very positive, actually. So it's been surprisingly positive in the sense of how much our community actually enjoy the game and how much they're engaging with it, even though it's just a very early stage and that we're releasing a demo that's not complete. I think there are some key elements of feedback that we are getting though. So a lot of that's around, some of it's around the controls, which is something that we're looking at. So the controls of the heroes and the abilities and so on. A lot of it's around just the usability of the screens out, kind of the management of the heroes and the items and the equipment, making that as seamless as possible. We know that there's some room to improve there. And then one thing that we're hoping to make invisible, which I think we've done a reasonable job of so far, is actually the blockchain part. So our goal is to onboard millions of players. We don't want them to need to know what a wallet is. And so having this seamless experience where there's no gas fees, where players can just make an account using an email and password and start playing, is something that we are doing as well. And that so far players haven't complained about that process of having to create a wallet, which is a good sign for onboarding more people into Web3 gaming.
And obviously a good sign for getting some of those traditional gamers across, I guess.
Exactly.
Some of the feedback I've seen spoken to there being a desire for more depth with the combat. Obviously, it's early days right now. So what's in store for the combat going forward?
So right now, one of the challenges is the visibility of the depth. So it's not that there isn't a lot of strategic depth. It's that it may not be that visible to the player, so that when they're looking at how their actions or decisions influence the gameplay, it's not as obvious. So that's one of the things that the team has taken away and is thinking about kind of ways to represent that more, so that it's clearer kind of how the strategic decisions that you're making, the team composition, the item setups, the different elemental advantages or disadvantages, and then also the timing of making these movements, so just making sure that we're representing the impact that they have.
Are you hamstrung at all to a certain extent that it's a mobile game, so you don't have that, I guess, the input options that you'd get from a console controller?
We don't think so, because we're building it to be a mobile game. So the audience of players who play mobile games are used to controlling the controls that you would have for mobile games, And so I think the level of action complexity that actually these players expect are less than maybe PC gamers, where you have 20 abilities that you can use. So we've been adapting to the type of audience that we think will play and learning a lot from other games out there who have solved this as well.
More on the subject, do you feel like Guild of Guardians is a game that may be able to come to consoles in the future or PC?
So technically it can. So we're able to test, for example, right now there's PC versions of the game which we internally use. I think it's not something that we have planned right now, because we're just very focused on making sure that the mobile game is successful, and that in itself is a massive audience, big challenge. So we want to get that right rather than being too spread thin. But in the future, if that goes well, we do have other options that are available.
So let's talk about the NFTs in the game. So you have obviously the common heroes in the free-to-play experience, which aren't NFTs. You got the NFT tradable heroes, and you got the NFT items. And it sounds like the energy boosters are also an NFT item. You got items crafted by the guilds. So have I understood all that correctly? Are these the main NFTs that people will be acquiring in Guild of Guardians?
Correct. Yes, I think that's right.
And can you tell me a little bit more about then how a scholar, for example, might come into the game and start with a free-to-play experience and be able to move up to a position of owning NFTs?
Yeah, so Guild of Guardians, kind of our goal is to build a really meaningful game that everyone can play. So for that reason, it is free to play, and someone can come in and start playing without knowing anything about blockchain, and start kind of having fun and progressing throughout the game. And so for us, when we think about scholars, kind of traditionally in Web3, scholars are people who play, but then have someone who kind of buy assets for them to play with. In Guild of Guardians, you don't actually need to buy assets to play. There's no initial barrier of entry there. So people don't need to be a scholar. They can just play. They can just be a player, and start playing. And so the way it works in Guild of Guardians is as you play the game, you progress as usual, and we have a in-game currency and token called gems. And so as you play, you do different quests and you do different activities to get some of these gems. That's one. And then on the other hand, you're also getting these different in-game resources as you play as well. So for example, you're able to summon heroes, you're able to get materials to craft equipment. And then whenever a player wants to craft equipment or create a new NFT item, such as a hero, then they'll need to spend some of those gems as well. And so that's kind of how we create this economy. So someone can start playing, they could earn gems over time, and then also spend those gems to create these NFTs.
Right, and there's also an NFT. You can actually merge some of those common heroes, I believe, once you've collected 5 of them. Is that correct?
Correct, exactly. So there are common heroes are just normal. They're not NFTs. They're just normal heroes. And then once you have 5 of the same identical hero or 8 different heroes, you can spend a small amount of gems, merge them, and then get a random hero of a higher rarity. And that goes up and up and up.
So obviously the crafting mechanic is quite interesting. A lot, the way that various players collect resources within the dungeons that are then used by a guild to create items which are then put to the marketplace. But one of the biggest pushbacks we see from traditional gamers when we talk about NFT market is why do I want to own it? Why do I want to have ownership of a digital item? So what would you say to these gamers about the benefits of why they should want to have ownership and why that's a value asset for them in a game like Guild of Guardians?
I think it's a lot of it is a philosophical thing, right? So players have these digital assets that they buy, that they spend, that they collect, or that they get rewarded with, and it makes sense for them to actually own them rather than to be renting them or for them to buy a skin but actually not be able to trade it. So it's kind of the benefit of if you have 2 games that are identical, one of them you also own stuff in the game and the other one you don't, then we believe at least that it's the first example is better because you have ownership. I think that's kind of one of the fundamental things that we want to bring to the industry. And then the other thing is we also want to use ownership to make the experience better, right? So if we take an example of Guild of Guardians, this is the kind of game where players really like to collect heroes. They really like to summon and, get that low probability to get that really rare hero and then start building out their collection. And actually ownership helps them with that because now you have something that's provably scarce. You have something which they could trade with other players. You have something which they don't even need to get from the developer. They don't need to spend money on us for it, right? They can trade with another player. They can get it from another player, which helps that other person. So, we're always thinking of ways of how can we use this technology to improve the player experience. So it's not just about ownership, but it's also about just a better gameplay experience, better distribution, better everything.
And so do you feel like your audience here is going to be predominantly made up of people who are engaged with blockchain gaming? Or, do you feel like you're going to be able to pull these traditional gamers across and how are you going to, I guess, onboard them or reach them?
So we're going to be going broad. So we're not only aiming to build this game for people who love crypto. That's not the goal. Our goal is we want to really onboard millions. more people to gaming, right? And to do that, everything we do is involved, is striving towards that goal, whether it's making sure the game is really engaging, making sure that even when I describe the game, I'm not describing the crypto elements, right? I'm describing the gameplay. And so, certainly our goal and ambition is to reach as many players as possible. It's one of the reasons why it's free to play. You don't need to create a wallet to play. All of these things are with that purpose. It's going to be a longer transition period. So right now, the industry is quite new. Most of our audience know what an NFT is just because, well, for us, the game isn't out yet. So like most likely they have some knowledge. But I think over time that will change, and we're already beginning to see that. And I think that the really interesting thing about our community is that there's one thing that ties them all together, which they all love like games, right? And they all like play similar games. And I think that's really promising. Like they're not here just because of crypto. They're not here just to try to make money, right? Like they actually all are gamers. And so that's something that we've already got, and we're looking to foster more and bring more people in.
Right. Well, I don't want to get too much into the economics in this video, but obviously you mentioned gems earlier. What I'm interested in is what do you think makes an economy work? What's a good economy look like in an NFT game for you?
So there's probably a few main things. So the first is around sustainability. So making sure that the game can last for a long time. And the way we think about this and do this is making sure that the rewards that people are getting are proportional to kind of the value they're inputting into the ecosystem. And that's really it. So like if a game gives out too many things to people who aren't really adding value, then ultimately the economy will be deflationary. So that's one end. It kind of it becomes a lot more complex than that, obviously, but the goal is sustainable economy. How can we make it last for years, not months? And then the second part is making the economy part of the game design as well. So in the real world economy, people have different roles, right? Like there are different ways to play, quote unquote, in the real world economy. You can be a designer, you can be an artist, you can do all these different things, you can try to start a business. And so when we think about the Guild of Guardians economy, we're trying to create something similar. There should be different ways to play, different ways to specialize. There should be a role for someone who wants to never spend money, but then they're actually adding value to this economy, in some way, and they fit in. And so that's another element which we're trying to do as well, which is create this real dynamic economy where trading is part of the experience and there's different ways to specialize and play and think about the strategies of being part of this.
And in terms of the roadmap, obviously you're saying before, I thought we had just hit earlier alpha, but you're saying that we haven't got to alpha yet. I know beta is looking at 2023. Are you on track? Do you feel like you've got a release date in mind at this point?
So our next two major milestones. So far we have released 2 demos of the game, which have gone pretty well. Both of those are on track. The next milestone for us is releasing on testnet, which is our equivalent of soft launching. So starting to really test the game to a wider audience. So our goal is to do that by the end of the year. We're currently on track for that. There's obviously tons of challenges in game development, but we're working through all of those and we're on track. In terms of mainnet, kind of think of it like the global launch normally in mobile games. So that's on track for the first half of next year, which we'll take the learnings from testnet, we'll look at how it performs, we'll probably make a few tweaks and changes, and then we'll once we're confident, once I think it's ready, then we'll go big.
Okay, great. And what about Apple? I mean, they can be a challenge to deal with, especially in this play to earn space. Are you ahead of that? Have you got past the challenges with launching on Apple, or are those still to come?
So we've been thinking about Apple ever since the beginning, and so we have a lot of the decisions we've made with the intent of making sure again, that the game is accessible by as many people as possible, and that means being on the app stores. So we have plans to be on both Apple and Google stores. We know we've spoken to people at those companies. We've designed the game specifically and the mechanics around it to make sure that it's compatible and compliant. And so, this is always not, we can never guarantee anything, but we're pretty confident that we've done everything we can to actually meet the requirements to play by the rules and be on those stores.
Okay, great. And just like one final question, and this is based on looking at the Immutable website. Now, I noticed a couple of major brands were referenced there, in particular Disney, Marvel, and Ubisoft. Can you just enlighten me as to how Immutable is involved with those companies?
So a lot of these companies, and there are more that we probably haven't announced yet, are working with Immutable X as this, basically the technology that they're using to power NFTs and whatever they're doing. And so they're using Immutable X as the platform, just like how we're using it as well at Guild of Guardians, in order to mint NFTs, help people do transfers, all in a gas-free, scalable, carbon-neutral way. So, some of a lot of the names that you see on the website, they all have things in development or that they've already launched things. And there's probably some that will continue to get announced as we can announce them.
Right, and so with someone like Ubisoft, for example, you haven't got a partnership there to help with the development or release of a game like Guild of Guardians.
So on Ubisoft, we were actually working with them on something separate, and we were part of this kind of small group of startups that were selected to be part of one of the programs to be incubated by them. But that's separate, I think, to what you're saying. So we're not currently developing a game for them, if that's kind of what you're asking.
All right, no worries, mate. Look, thanks very much for your time. I really, really appreciate you taking me through Guild of Guardians. The game is definitely looking exciting. It does sound like there's a fair bit to go over the next 7 or 8 months, but it's shaping up as a gameplay first NFT game, which is what I like to see. Thanks very much, mate. I appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions.
Once again, thank you very much to Derek for his time there and taking us through what Guild of Guardians is going to provide as it develops through the next year and a half or so until release. Now, I will try and get hands-on with the game myself and bring you some more content related to it. We'll also try and catch up with Derek again in the future to find out how things have progressed and any new developments in the game world. But until then, make sure you check out my other videos. I've got plenty more for you to see on the channel. Subscribe, and until next time, happy gaming. You.